As the first land grant institution established under the 1862 Morrill Act, we acknowledge that the state of Kansas is, historically, home to many native nations, including the Kaw, Osage, and Pawnee, among others. Furthermore, Kansas is the current home to 4 federally recognized native nations: the Prairie Band Potawatomi, the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and the Sac and Fox Nation Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska.
Many native nations utilized the western plains of Kansas as their hunting grounds, and others, such as the Delaware, were moved through this region during Indian removal efforts to make way for white settlers. It's important to acknowledge this, since the land that serves as the foundation of this institution was, and still is, stolen land.
We remember these truths because K-State's status as a land-grant institution is a story that exists within ongoing settler colonialism and rests on the dispossession of indigenous peoples and nations from their lands. These truths are often invisible to many. The recognition that K-State's history begins and continues through indigenous contexts is essential.
Please remember
these truths
because we still remember.
Well, good morning. My name, I should introduce myself, is Kent Michael Smith. I'm the director here at the Beach Museum of Art, and we are so pleased to welcome all of you to the Sujin Covacevich Education Conference, organized in collaboration with the exhibition To the Stars Through Art, a history of art collecting in Kansas public schools from 1900 to 1950. I should add that this conference will be recorded and made available through the museum's YouTube channel, so I'll extend my welcome to those that may be joining us via YouTube. I want to thank major exhibition sponsors or funders: Humanities Kansas, a non-profit cultural organization that connects communities with history, traditions, and ideas to strengthen civic life; the Friends of the Beach Museum of Art; the Alms Group; and Kansas Magazine. We also want to thank Kansas State's Chapman Center for Rural Studies and the K-State Indigenous Faculty and Staff Alliance for their contributions to this project. Finally, we wish to express our sincere gratitude to the sponsors of this conference: Teresa Grana, which is in this room, hiding behind somebody else. Teresa's niece, Sue Setliff, her nephew Bob and his wife Nancy Van Dyke, and another nephew Ted and his wife Pam Van Dyke. All are relatives of Sujin Covacevich, for which this conference is named. Covacevich was a dynamic artist and art educator from South Central Kansas, and was someone who made a difference in the lives of countless persons, including school children. Covacevich helped develop an art collection for the Winfield Public Schools, and you'll be finding out much more about her in a few of the presentations today. Thank you again, Teresa, the artist's daughter, and Sue, Bob, and Nancy, as well as Ted and Pam, for making this conference possible. Next, I want to welcome to the podium curator Liz Seaton, who led the development of this exhibition for which this conference is being organized. And I will let her tell you more about the conference, the agenda, as well as the exhibition. But first, I do want to take a moment, and as we welcome her to the podium, maybe give a little extra clap. I just want to say this year marks 20 years for Liz being involved here as a curator at the Beach Museum, and I think she deserves a little extra hand for that.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here so early. Welcome. This exhibition, you have the title, tells the story of an incredible moment in Kansas history when many communities, rural and urban, stretching across the state, embraced the idea that exposure to the visual arts was an important part of a child's education. School administrators, artists, artist organizations, women's groups, and many others in Kansas during this special time lasting several decades believed that art was not an extra, that it opened doors, that it had significant things to offer a child, including making the school environment more pleasant to boost mood and enabling teaching on a range of subjects from history to architecture to art, science, and many more subjects. So when you come away from today's conference, I hope you will have a good sense of this story and some knowledge about the individuals and historical forces that made it happen. The first panel of speakers will help with this. You'll hear three history-focused presentations by Corey North of the Burgess Sensei Memorial Gallery in Lindsberg, Kara Heitz, a lecturer in history at the Kansas City Art Institute, and myself. And I'll make longer introductions at the beginning of each panel, or in this case, I'm going to introduce the speakers as they come up. The speakers on our second panel are all members of the Beach Museum of Art's education team, Catherine Schlajic, Kim Richards, and Nate McClendon, who's also behind the camera. And they're going to present ideas for using artwork in learning and outreach. And so during this panel, you'll have a chance to do a visual thinking strategy exercise, so it'll be a group participation activity. And the two speakers on the third panel after lunch will provide insight into how the collections of two school districts in Winfield and Parsons are being maintained and incorporated into school and community life. I'm sure they'll attest that it's a process, but one that is entirely worth it. So I hope you'll come away from this conference inspired and motivated to go back to a school district and think of ways to make use of an existing art collection there in teaching and community outreach, or even to start an art collection for the district. And I wanted to be sure to mention that this exhibition in its entirety, all text and images, will be available online for use as a resource, hopefully by the end of this year. Guidance for teachers and resources related to collection care, the video from next Thursday's event will be added to the site over time. We are also just received approval from the University Press of Kansas in Lawrence to produce a publication with more scholarly essays about this project, which will probably be released in about a year. We still have some fundraising to do. Here's another sort of mock-up of the introduction to the sections of the exhibition that will appear on the website. So before I begin my talk, first, I wanted to thank a few people, additional people. I wanted to recognize the collaborators on the exhibition. This would not have been possible with their help. They were basically co-curators working with me, and that was Kara Heitz, Corey North, Cindy Mines, who's the chair of the McPherson School's Art Collection Committee, Beth Jansen, who is here today and is the curatorial consultant for the Wichita Public Schools Art Collection, Tara Hedrick, the curator at the Wichita Art Museum, Travis Campbell, the director of the Haskell Cultural Center and Museum in Lawrence, and Tara Mitchell, Deputy Tribal Historic Preservation Officer of the Prairie Band Potawatomi in Mayetta, Kansas. I also want to give a shout out to the exhibition lenders. We asked to borrow objects from 19 institutions, schools, and museums, and a few private individuals. And these 65 plus loans represent the art collecting histories of 15 school districts from Waukene to Kansas City, Kansas, to Parsons and McPherson. And others here. Are there any other lenders here? There's Winfield represented. Manhattan, I think, is represented. Yeah. And finally, I'd like to thank the staff of the Beach Museum of Art for their Herculean efforts to bring this big project and its related programs together and to get the word out about them. And there are two student staff members we need to recognize today. The curatorial department's graduate student assistant, Hannah Palsa, a PhD candidate in history at K-State. Hannah put in hours and hours of research and compilation work on this project. And Haley Walker, this fall's Beach Museum of Art education intern, and Catherine Schlajic, our Director of Education, will talk more about her contribution. And Haley, are you here? Raise your hand. Thank you. Okay, two views of the exhibition. You'll have a chance to see it. If you haven't already, near the end of the conference, or you can slip in there during the lunch hour. So what I'm going to do is provide an overview of the exhibition, this project, and I'll talk about how it came about and what has been learned after several years of research that really continues. At the end, I'm going to go into a little bit of depth about the exhibition's opening section, because looking at it helps us get a sense of the forces that shape this remarkable moment in the history of public education in this state. So a little story, the idea for the exhibition. In the early 2000s, when I had just defended my dissertation at Northwestern University, I got a job at the Art Institute of Chicago in the education department. I was hired to help produce a website about an outreach program in the Chicago Public Schools related to their many historic murals. The museum had gotten a grant to hire some young staff to work with teachers to develop learning activities using the murals in their schools. And the associate director of the education department at the Art Institute brought me on because of my doctoral research, which was related to the Depression-era New Deal art projects. And many of the Chicago public school murals had been produced by artists hired, unemployed artists hired as part of those projects. So in addition to producing this website, and I'm showing you the homepage, it's still there, I'm glad to say, after 20 years. I had the good fortune during my 3 years at the Art Institute to co-organize an exhibition about the Chicago School Art Collection, which was in the Rice Galleries. Really nice thing that we got on the schedule. We used works that could be moved, and many of these murals can't, for that exhibition. And then I was able to contribute to a book about the collection, the school collection produced by a woman associated with the murals conservation. The school district had launched a conservation campaign raising money for that. While I was at the Art Institute, my husband and I had a daughter, and we decided to come home to Kansas to be nearer to our families. I was raised in Winfield, and for a little time in Neodesha. And I got a job here, and so inspired by my exposure to this project, this artwork, I kept in my pocket the idea of an exhibition devoted to art acquired by Kansas schools as sort of a concept. But it took me a while. Numerous exhibitions later, it finally became possible for me to turn my attention to the topic. And after 7 years of research with other committed and generous scholars and curators, who I've mentioned, in Kansas, we are here now. Very excited about it. So how did we begin the huge task of figuring out which schools had historic artwork? There were some studies, some secondary sources about school art collections that had been produced already, and those were about McPherson and Winfield. A book had been produced about McPherson's collection, and there had been research and essays written by Bob Hartley of Winfield and talks he had presented there. So we could rely on those, but that was really it. So it was clear from the beginning that we had much research to do and school visiting to do. But we knew it would be impossible to visit every school in Kansas. And I suspect, having done this project, that if we had just put out a call to superintendents for information, I don't think we would have gotten a lot of response. They're kind of busy. And then there was COVID, during this project. So we started with archival research, and I'm showing you some examples of things we found. We did a lot of newspapers.com database research. Hannah Palso, who I mentioned earlier, did quite a bit of this work. We looked at high school yearbooks. We looked at high school newspapers. We looked at archives, the Berger Sanzay Memorial Art Gallery and Kansas State Historical Society. And this comes from the Sedgwick County Museum in Wichita. These are WPA records from the Spencer Library at KU, just some samples. And we found a lot. And these are my files for each school district that we found something about related to this project. And it goes on all the way to, not Z, but somewhere down in that direction. This is a list of works that are by Berger Sanzane that are known to be in school districts that the director of the Sanzane Memorial Gallery had produced and was very helpful. Their records were key for this project. And this is a map that I produced of the places that we found some activity. All the way to northwest Kansas, southwest Kansas. There's sort of this corridor where there was a lot of activity you can see above and below Wichita. So then we made targeted inquiries to school systems, often struck out. Superintendents would not have the history that we thought they would have had. They wouldn't know. Sometimes they would have a few things that they would call back to let us know about. Some staff, we worked with staff too. Sometimes we struck it big, and there were schools that knew what they had documented what they had, and even had appraisals for their collections. And many were really happy to show us what they had. So we made these targeted trips to maybe a couple of dozen schools, and let me tell you, then it was a matter of selecting works for the exhibition that could function in several ways. So it was a kind of math problem for me, I would say, to tell stories and lay out themes that had emerged during our research to help us represent activity in as many areas of the state as possible, and to help us demonstrate the high quality of the work acquired, and content-wise to be maybe useful for teaching, so the things that we knew that our education staff could make good use of, and teachers out there. So there were layered reasons to make the selection of the 65 plus objects in the exhibition. And in the end, we chose to borrow, or asked to borrow, works that would represent 15 school districts. But as I mentioned, many of these things had migrated from schools to museums, so that's where we found things, or junior colleges in some case. We discovered that there was an interesting relationship between high schools and junior colleges early on in the junior college histories. So, in terms of this larger story, what were the themes that emerged? So, we found out that there were many fewer murals in Kansas compared to Chicago and other major cities in the United States, but there were stunning examples of historic paintings, works on paper, prints and drawings, sculpture, and arts and crafts objects. We found out that the story of art collecting in Kansas K through schools went back much earlier than the Depression era, which is what I had assumed I would find, all the way to the early 1900s. We discovered that these works had come to schools in a variety of ways, from art exhibitions organized by school districts or borrowed by school districts that were used as fundraisers through ticket sales to the community, that money being used to buy art objects for a collection. Some came in as graduating class gifts. Some were donated by individuals and organizations, for example, women's clubs. There's pretty heavy involvement of women's clubs in this history. And yes, some were acquired from the WPA art projects created in Kansas to assist unemployed artists and artisans here. And as mentioned, we discovered schools across the state were involved. And our working theory is that this is unique to Kansas. Although more research is needed, we kind of hope that this project will assist scholars who might be considering looking at what was going on in other states during the same period. So all of this is really something to celebrate, but the more we learn, the more we recognize that this school collecting activity before the mid-20th century was a complex history. There were issues of access to consider. So we tried to look into whether or not certain objects had been collected by segregated schools in Kansas. We created a list of those schools because this is the period right before Brown v. Board, that our ending date is right before that. And so we found only one in terms of records, example of a WPA print by Mary Huntoon that was allocated or sent to Louverture School in Wichita, which was a K through 8th grade, or first grade through 8th grade school for Black students. And there were things to consider connected to the idea of cultural representation. For example, only one work by a black artist that we could collect for this exhibition, the Harlem Renaissance figure Aaron Douglas. And that is an example of a design he made for the cover of a yearbook, Topeka High School yearbook from 1917. And there he is in that yearbook pictured. And he went on to very great things in New York. And then there are also issues of the way in which certain groups were represented, such as Native Americans. This is Walter Ufer, two girls from the collection of the Wichita Public Schools. And a lot of what's represented in the exhibition is sort of a Eurocentric view of representing landscapes, portraits, and looking at groups and sometimes providing that point of view, but not the group's point of view. But Native Americans and their history and culture are a prominent subject in this exhibition because that's what we found. And there's just more to that story that Kara Heitz is going to talk about, and it's a very interesting story. This is an example, I wanted to show you this, of a diorama produced in Lawrence for a WPA workshop depicting the history of, there were 6 of these depicting the history of Native American groups in Kansas who had lived, owned land, or been active in Kansas during the territory and the state's history. Kara will talk more about these. Yes. So you'll see that these themes that emerged, this was the structure we decided on for the exhibition, and you'll see these sections. You don't need to read them all, but we have 5 main categories, and that's origin stories, picture study, which is about the use of art reproductions, the acquisition of art reproductions by schools, Sanzane and his legacy, and the New Deal period. We also have a small section devoted to schools that have gone on to collect after the 1950s or after 50, and collection care. So I want to look at the origin story section just a bit before inviting Corey to speak about Berger Sanzane. And some background would be to explain a little bit about this moment and how it was situated in progressive era ideals. The progressive era is defined, I'm going to quote here, from the 1880s to the 1920s, that period, the widespread social activism and political reform that focused on defeating corruption, monopoly, waste, and inefficiency. In America, progressives sought to address the problems caused by rapid industrialization, immigration, and political corruption, and the enormous concentration of wealth in the country. And it's confusing if you're looking into it. This period, there were overlapping groups, trying to accomplish these ideals. But some of them were museum professionals. So during the 1870s and into the 1920s, this early period I'm talking about, dozens of major museums opened their doors to the public across the country with objects that had been accumulated by these very wealthy people in the US. So I'm showing you the Met down below, which opened in 1872, the Art Institute of Chicago in the upper right, which opened in 1879, the Carnegie Museum of Art down in the lower right, opened in 1896, and the Toledo Museum of Art, which opened in 1901 and then built this beautiful structure and opened in 1912, opened that in 1912. Especially in the early part of the 20th century, there was this move to increase the public's access to art in museums. It was marked by particular efforts to do this, and a lot of talk about how this would benefit the citizenry and democracy. Art historian Jeffrey Trask discusses this moment and uses the Met as a case study in a 2012 book on art museums, and he says, and this is kind of a long quote, sorry, a new generation of museum reformers ushered in an institutional revolution that redefined the relationship between art museums and industrial urban society in the US. Determined to overturn the image of museums as elite storehouses of art,
Those curators and administrators developed a progressive museum agenda that linked art and beauty to citizenship. Combining the era's impulses for civic and urban reform with new professional standards and a commitment to democratic access, they turned art museums into modern, efficient educational institutions in service to the people. And this was a particular moment. He's looking at the Met, and he does talk about a kind of retrenchment in terms of this effort. But these are the early days of museum education efforts. It was, interestingly, the period in which the American Association of Museums was formed. That was at a meeting in New York in 1906. And at that meeting, the new association decided to pass a resolution to create a formal partnership with the National Education Association. So that alliance started early. And it was a real signal that educating the public, including the school-age public, was a priority for museums. And how they kind of implemented this varied. So back to Kansas, the Art Institute of Chicago developed an interesting program that can be credited with having jump-started the Wichita Public Schools art collection. And I don't know if I said this earlier, but I wanted to look at these sections because I wanted to talk about like the outside forces that were acting on things here, and then the kind of grassroots activity that we can credit for having really made Kansas's sort of this history so broad, the claim we're making that it was broader than any state we know about. So a person named Ross Crane from the Art Institute of Chicago, who was hawking information about what they called their Better Homes Institute, was giving talks around the country, and he came to Wichita in 1919 to lecture on the merits of good design in homes and civic spaces. So part of the progressive era sort of included a kind of effort to concentrate on making the country more beautiful in terms of parks and the development of museums, and advice about how to make your home and your civic structures better designed, sort of anti-Victorian, anti-industrial, pro-handmade objects kind of thing, and pro-American crafts and art. So his circuit, Ross Crane's circuit, included the Wichita High School, and when he was giving a talk to students about some of these ideas, he offered to donate an original painting by a contemporary American artist if the students would raise money to purchase another one. So 2 years later, the students had successfully raised funds to purchase an oil painting by Jarrett Beneker, who is in his studio on the left, and the painting is called The Lumber Schooner, and it's on the right, a detail. And they did so through fundraising events, but also through giving up their movie-going, making picture show pledges. And this painting, which was valued at that time at $450, they raised something close to that amount, and that was several $1,000s at that time. And they helped select the work. So this is believed to be the first original oil painting acquired by the Wichita schools. Beth Jansen and I determined this through sort of hours and hours of looking through the high school newspaper. Here's the announcement. And now, after that, the Wichita schools continued their collecting, and they have several hundred objects at this time that are hung in East High School, Robinson Middle School, and North High School. So it became one of the largest collections in the state. And I wanted to mention that, again, that this is a great example of how things happening in the U.S. are kind of reaching into Kansas. And I wanted to just say that in Kansas at this time, there weren't art museums yet. It does so happen that this year that the Beneker painting was purchased, the Mulvane Art Museum opened in 1922. University of Kansas's Art Museum didn't open until 1928. The Wichita Art Museum didn't open until 1935. That doesn't mean there wasn't art activity in those cities, but in terms of art museums open to the public, that was the case. And the Nelson Atkins Museum, which is really in Missouri, opened in 1933. So it was a little bit, I wouldn't say barren in Kansas, but it wasn't the same as what was happening in other cities like Toledo and all over, all the way to Portland, Maine. So the second story we have in the origin story section is the About McPherson and its art collection. And as I said, I wanted to talk about that as an example of some key individuals who founded this sort of collection and then continued to have an impact in Kansas afterward or outside of McPherson. George Pinney, the new superintendent of McPherson in 1911, decided to organize an exhibition to acquire artwork for a new high school. He had come from Hiawatha. He was a math teacher, but he believed that education in the arts was lacking in the McPherson schools. So he decided to put together an exhibition that comprised art reproductions from a Boston-based publishing company. And I'm showing you the 1911 catalog that would have been sent to schools to show them what was available, and the Copley prints. This Boston-based company would approach schools about taking exhibitions of their work that might have numbered, it's indicated in newspapers, up to 200 pieces. And then they suggested the idea of selling tickets and to raise money to buy basically their prints. So he organized the first exhibition in 1911 with these art reproductions, but he used the money collected to have the students buy original works of art. And the piece that was purchased in that exhibition is this one by Charles Hallberg called Lake Michigan. They also purchased a Berger-Sanzane painting that I'm not showing here. Hallberg was an associate of Berger-Sanzane and a fellow Swede. So he helped broker that arrangement. He helped invite Hallberg to show his work at the exhibition, and then they made the purchase out of the exhibition. I would suggest that Pinney, the superintendent, got his idea to start an original art collection from this notion of selling tickets, which had been going on in Kansas. These companies had been circulating their exhibitions in Kansas going back to the 1900s. There is an entire section of that about that history in the exhibition. Pinney, the next year, worked with an art dealer in McPherson. McPherson had an art gallery to organize an exhibition of original art only. The dealer who shown it right was Carl Smalley. He had been inspired by a trip to the St. Louis Exposition in 1904, and he brought home the idea of selling art and books in his father's feed store. This is one of his catalogs from a little bit later, telling you about the books and the ceramics and the art that you could purchase, and it features Berger-Sanzane's work on the cover and the back cover. The work purchased from the 1912 exhibition was this beautiful painting by Harold Dunbar called The Morning Letter, and Dunbar was active in Massachusetts and New York. So again, the Smalley and Sanzane and those working with Pinney were making contacts with associates and getting them to submit works from all over the United States for this exhibition. It's kind of amazing. So in McPherson, these exhibitions lasted up into the mid-1930s. And McPherson continued to acquire objects, one or two or more, from each of these exhibitions. That they have a really major and interesting collection now. And a lot of it is in the central office of the schools. Not much of it is in the schools themselves currently. And there are quite a few objects in the McPherson Museum. There's an entire gallery devoted to the school art collection. So it's a wonderful place to visit to see some great examples of what they acquired. So here's Berger-Sanzane. I wanted to bring him up because he often had a number of works in each of the McPherson annual exhibitions, and he was often the keynote speaker at those exhibitions. And as I mentioned, his contacts were key, so were Smalley's. They worked together well. And he went on after this after he got started from early on, to launch a campaign on his own to travel to schools, give talks, bring his artwork, and in many cases those schools acquired his work. We discovered, with help from Corey North, that there were some 90 schools in the state that acquired his oil paintings and prints, and maybe not quite that number still have them, but they went all over the state. And I'm going to give it to Corey next so she can talk more about Senzane's influence on this history.